the 21, A Journey into the Land of Coptic Martyrs. That title is taken from the book we're helping to launch today, authored by Martin Mosebach, whom you'll hear from shortly. The book recounts his journey into Egypt to discover the stories of some of the 21 Christians brutally murdered by ISIS terrorists 4 years ago this month. Those murders were filmed by the terrorists. Although I have never watched the video, the photographic images of those men in their orange prisoner suits, kneeling on the shores of the Mediterranean, each with a hooded executioner behind him, are seared in my mind, as I suspect they are in many of yours. I understand that many of those men had the name of their Lord on their lips as they died. Their murders were brutal assaults on human rights and human dignity, but they were more. They signaled the deepening of a violent, rapacious form of religious persecution, the targeted slaughter of a religious minority under the banner of religion itself. This form of terrorism cannot be defeated with armies. It is a malign and virulent religious ideology that must, in the end, be defeated by religion itself, by devout Muslims of the Middle East who abhor violence in the name of Islam, and by non-Muslims who stand with them. So let me say a word about the Religious Freedom Institute and how it approaches this issue. The RFI is an outgrowth of a decade work at Georgetown University. That work included my colleagues Tim Shaw and Byron Johnson of Baylor University, both of whom are part of RFI's leadership team, as is Ken Hill, the executive director of RFI, whom you'll hear from in just a moment. The Religious Freedom Institute funds scholars here and around the world to conduct research on the meaning and value of religious freedom for everyone and for all societies. But we don't just put that research in books and libraries. We employ it to advance religious freedom on the ground. We do that with action teams in South and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and North America. We also have an action team on international religious freedom policy and one on Islam and religious freedom. One of our major projects is to support Middle Eastern Muslims in their effort to develop and propagate Islamic arguments against violence in the name of Islam and in favor of religious freedom for all citizens of Muslim-majority societies. We assist them by providing evidence of religious freedom's value, not only to the religion of Islam, but to the stabilizing impact of pluralism, to the undermining of religion-related violence and terrorism that destroys Muslims as well as others, and religious freedom's value to economic growth. The Religious Freedom Institute applies this same model in all of its work, both abroad and in the United States. So we invite you to explore our work by visiting our webpage, getting on a mailing list, talking to us today during the coffee break and tonight in our reception after this event, and joining us again at conferences such as this one. So let's get started. Let me bring to the stage my friend and colleague, Ken Hill. Ken, as I say, is the Executive Director of the Religious Freedom Institute and the head of our Middle East Action Team. Ken, over to you.
Good afternoon. I'm really privileged to be here. And I can say with all honesty that in the preparation for the discussion I'm going to have with the author in just a moment, I can't remember in many years having enjoyed the preparation for an event as much as I have for this one and in the reading of the book. But let me begin by telling you a little bit about the author, Martin Mosebach, the author of the 21 A Journey into the Land of Coptic Martyrs. Martin is a resident of Frankfurt, Germany. but he began his career in law, but got distracted along the way. And for the past 35 years or so, he's actually written 11 novels, one of which is available in English. But he's done a number of other things as well. He's written poems and short stories, even librettos, essays on literature, travel writing. All of these things are part of his very important repertoire of writing, an independent-minded public intellectual. And not only has he written these things, but he is recognized in Germany and in Europe as a really remarkable writer. And in fact, he's been awarded Germany's most prestigious literary prize, the Georg Büchner Prize, for the way his work, and I love this phrase in describing why they gave him the award, his work combines the gorgeousness of style with primal joy in storytelling. And when you get a chance to read this book, you will recognize why that characterization is indeed quite accurate. Other awards that he has received include the Heinrich von Kleist Prize, the Grand Prize of the Bavarian Academy of Fine Arts, the Goethe Clock in the city of Frankfurt. He's even a member of the German Academy for Language and Literature. So he's a very accomplished writer indeed. And we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about how somebody with this background ended up writing the book that we're going to be talking about tonight. But before I call Martin up to the stage where we will have a little bit of a dialogue, talk about the book, and then open it up for maybe a few minutes of questions before we have a coffee break, I want to tell you a little bit about what I think is so unusual about this book. And I've read maybe several dozen books over the last 3 or 4 decades that deal with persecution or religious freedom issues. This book is utterly unusual. Why do I say that? What's so unusual about this particular book? A lot of times the focus is on those who commit the violence. Not this book. This book barely mentions that. This focus is not on the persecutors. The focus neither is on the religious, political, economic, or other motives which may have motivated these barbaric deeds. You will soon discover that's not what this book is about. Indeed, the author is interested, and intensively so, in something else. He's interested in who these victims were. He wants to know what they believed and how what they believed prepared them to face death serenely and without capitulation. Something that you will note in the pages of the opening part of the book, but also if you do make yourself watch the video, what he describes is indeed accurate. He focuses on what the history and character of the Coptic Church is, the Church of the Martyrs, as he describes it near the end of the book. And by extension, he wants to know about that faith. He wants to know about that 2 millennia of suffering and poverty and seeming continual powerlessness and weakness. That church, that Coptic church. And he asks the question, what does that particular church have to teach the rest of the Christian world and the world at large? And at a time when parts of the Christian world, even in the West right now, are beginning to face more discrimination, in some cases persecution, it's particularly important to ask the question, what does this book and what do these Coptic martyrs have to teach us today? And during this time of the rise, in the West at least, of a more militant form of a kind of fundamentalist secularism. And one can't read this book without being assaulted with the possibility that there really might be a world out there that is religious. There really might be a reality out there utterly beyond the world of flesh and blood, beyond materialism, beyond mortality, a world in which miracles actually occur. And there are sections in this book that will be quite foreign to the contemporary ear, talking about miracles both before and after the death of the martyrs in question. It's not very polite to talk about miracles in the West today. This book addresses them. A world defined by the existence of a good God who somehow sustains his human creation despite suffering and evil. A world where a 3-hour liturgy, utterly incomprehensible to most, bears witness to that which is most real, most normal, and most joy-giving. Those are just a few characterizations about what you will find in this book when you get a chance to read it. And so now I'm going to ask Martin if he would come forward and sit in that chair on the far side of the stage. And we're going to talk just a little bit about some questions that came to mind for me as I read this book and may be of interest to you, and be thinking yourself about some things you may want to follow up with towards the end of this session. Well, thank you, Martin. This is a great privilege for me to meet you. And I told my wife that I was going to have to order the one novel that's available in English, and even the book that has to do with liturgy, which fascinates me as well. So those were just serendipitous discoveries along the way in reading about you. But that biography that I read to the assembled folks here about your background, the novels, the poetry, all of these interesting writings. If I were to read that, if I'd read that, say, a month ago, I would not necessarily have thought that you're the person who would have chosen this topic. And so I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about what drew you into this story.
Well, in fact, it was something new for me to make such a book. I never made something like that before. You told the audience after 11 novels, I was going to begin as 12th one, and I told this to myself, this ominous number 12, before I should do something completely different, something what is not literature in quotation, but is something which has a serious impact, which is not a question of the language and but of the subject itself. Well, this fascination by the Oriental Christianity, by Orthodox liturgy, it's very old with me, and I have written also on the old Latin liturgy, and I learned very early that you cannot understand Latin liturgy if you do not see it together with the Orthodox liturgy, for this is the richer one, and you need the Orthodox liturgy to explain the Latin liturgy exactly. And this was one of the big mistakes of the reformer of the Latin liturgy after the Second Vatican Council, that they did not concern the Oriental liturgies at all. So they made many mistakes. So this was this situation before I began particularly to come nearer to this issue. Then it was the picture on a cover of a journal, of a magazine in Germany, Vatican magazine was its name, where the head of one of the beheaded martyrs, Kyrios, was to be seen as a nearly sleeping well, this was really a moment of enchantment. I I cut this picture out of this journal, and I had it while writing my last novel, always before me, which was not at all a religious novel, and not at all an edifying novel, but he accompanied me and helped me.
You described early in the book passport pictures, or pictures of these young men. And I'm wondering, just based on what you've said, was there something, you've talked about this in the book, something about a serenity, something there triggered in you the thought that there may be, some very deep faith behind these young men. Do you pick that up a little bit from the pictures even?
Well, no, it is the picture where this sleeping picture had such a peace. This was so convincing. This piece was something extraordinary. Of course, after a picture like this, you cannot say what was inside of that brain. And so I had to make this trip to visit the families and to visit the country.
And I'm curious about that. When you made your decision to go and you met with the metropolitan in the area in Upper Egypt, where a lot of these young men were from. Only a couple of them were even in their 40s. The rest were much younger. When you met with the metropolitan, then you met with the parents and the relatives and the friends of these young men. You already knew something about the Coptic Church. But what did you learn that most surprised you about their background, about who they were, how they were raised?
Well, it was surprising for me how pure the Coptic Church has preserved the origins of Christianity. This I really couldn't, had not realized that before. That really after this long time of suppression and persecution, 1,400 years long, that this was not only a time which has to be regretted, but which had also brought a great spiritual fruit to keep fresh the state of early Christianity until our days. You know, we are, a church is, all people in the church who are looking for reforms of the church, reforms always are necessary, have to look back to ancient Christianity. How were the early communities? How were the early traditions? How were this is a necessary research for any Christian reform. But normally they try to, like archaeologists, to dig out the traditions full of speculations of the historians and so on. But here you find the things living. You have not to speculate. You can see how was the thinking 2,500 years ago. How was the thinking, the spirituality, this living in the presence of God, this living without the feeling of history, this living without this relativism of values which has become normal for us. And the spontaneity to look in the liturgy over the frontier of the visible world.
Right. I was struck by the attitude of the parents or the family to the very notion of martyrdom, of suffering. And I was amazed at how different it was from what you would encounter, say, in America, maybe in Europe as well. But for example, I was raised in an evangelical Protestant home. I'm Catholic now, but I was raised in a Protestant home. And when you encountered suffering, you would pray about it, but you would pray to be delivered from it. You would pray for this to be an opportunity for God to manifest His power and to be freed from the physical impairment of whatever faced you. In Catholicism, I've noted a little bit more among very serious Catholics of the first reaction might be, sure, I don't want to do this, like Jesus prayed in the garden, let this, I'm not crazy about what's ahead. Yes. But it was still, it's possible this is God's will, that I am to work something out, and that I don't want to be blind to what God is going to do with my suffering. Yes. Then I read your book, and I was stunned by what some of these parents said. I think it was one of the parents said, we prayed when he was in captivities during that 43 days. Not so much that he would be spared, but that he would be faithful. Yes. I was really struck by that. And you connect it later to something connected to the Coptic Church and hundreds of years of mainly being second-class citizens at best, but many times much worse. That their faith was very much wedded to a notion that their plight, their cross might well involve suffering.
Yes, this is really the voice of early Christianity. You will find such reactions in the relatives in the early times of martyrdom under Emperor Diocletian, under the emperors before. Exactly like this, the mothers who are saying, we pray for that he stay firm and that he stay faithful and not that he survives. This is so astonishing, so amazing to hear the real voice of early Christianity here by people who are our contemporaneans.
The Metropolitan at one point said to you, it's a very strange thing to say in any way, thank you to those who did this. Yeah. But and remember, it was 6 days later that they were named saints. He said, it's very odd to say this, but they, rather than their terror being the opportunity to prove that this barbarism would eventually win, yes, it was a testimony to the whole world, yes, not by secondhand reports, but by video, yes, that these young men were faithful and that violence is not going to be the last word in this. You yes, gave us the opportunity and them the opportunity to bear witness. Quite an extraordinary statement for that Metropolitan to say.
Yes, and it is a completely different point of view as we are it's our habit. Of course, it is horrible what is happening against Christians, the persecution of Christians in the Near East. But this is not the only point of view. It is not only the question of injustice. There is also another point of view. This is the other point of view is that all these temptations belong to the nature of Christianity, right. Are not just a mischief. It's not just something to avoid, to overwhelm. No, it belongs. It's martyrdom. Christianity belong together, and there are two sides of one coin, and from the first beginning of the Christianity, which is the religion of the cross.
Right. There was a line in your book where you said you were struck by the utter absence of a call for vengeance.
Yes.
And you were struck by the fact that some of the parents even talked about forgiveness. And the thing that came to mind, of course, to me was what Stephen said as he was being stoned, or what Jesus said as he's being nailed to the cross about forgive them for they know not what they're doing. And I remember a couple of years ago reading the terrorist manual that Bakr Baghdadi wrote, who is the ideologue and the leader behind ISIS. And the title of the sort of the handbook was, it's a handbook on terror. And their belief was that terror will be what will say to the world, we are inescapable. You cannot escape us. Here is a point of view so radically at odds with that.
Yes.
And you make the point that the way they died and the result of their death was an absolute slap in the face to whatever extremists using violence try to do and accomplish.
Yes, for changing it, transform it into a triumph of the faith, of the living in the supernatural world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, there was another, I've thought about this before, whether you go into a Protestant church or a Catholic church, you see the cross or the crucifix up there. And it's such an astounding thing to people that a symbol of a religion would have at its heart the notion that what the world considers evil and suffering can somehow be transformed by God into that which will produce his will.
Yes, exactly.
And these young men epitomize that sort of. Now, there was another very odd line in the book I want to ask you about. I can't remember if it was a priest or a family member said, these were just normal young men.
Yes.
Just normal young men. And you said, most of us, when we think of normal young men in their late teens or early 20s, we might be thinking of, we wouldn't think about the liturgy, or we wouldn't think about church. We might think about drinking too much or womanizing or something. That would be kind of normal. And yet what you encountered was that in this world, there was a kind of normalcy to a very deep faith. And when the 43 were in captivity in Libya, you talked about what the priests bore witness to. Tell a little bit about what they said about these young men in their before they were captive, but before while they were working as migrants in Libya.
They lived together in a room. They slept on the floor in one room, and they transformed the room in a chapel. And they asked as much as possible priests coming to celebrate liturgy with them, and some of them were hymnists, were minor clerics, despite of being illiterate, and they sung the liturgy there whenever they were free, and singing the religious chants, the hymns, the litanies, was their business when they were free together, in their evenings, in their nights.
Right. It's it's fascinating. Before I read the book, I guess I would have assumed these were mainly young men. They might have been Coptic Orthodox or something else, but their religion might have been more, how shall I say, nominal. I have a friend who says that most Christians are de facto atheists, by which he means that we go to church on Sunday, but we live very much like our secular neighbors.
Yes.
The religion hasn't seeped deep into our souls to change our whole outlook on life. If you're steeped in a 3-hour liturgy that's utterly otherworldly,
yes,
which these young men seem to have been, they really are a testimony to another world that most who call themselves religious may not be such a vibrant testimony to.
Yes. Well, I'm far from idealizing the Coptic world. People in Cairo told me, well, you will not find the real Copts in Cairo or in Alexandria, but you will find them in Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt, this is the mainland of the Copts, and there you will find our religion in the highest state of power.
Right. Well, I'm going to end my questions here, except maybe to just note this, that those of you who get an opportunity to read the book, I think you'll find fascinating near the end of the book when Martin reflects a little bit on what it is we might learn from people who took religion so seriously at a time when secularism seems to be on the rise in the West. And you speculate that it may be very important to understand who these people are and what they have borne witness to by their lives and their deaths. Let me open it up to you, and if you have any questions for Martin, please feel free to stand and introduce yourself and then ask your question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Nina Shea. Yes, Nina Shea, Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom. I want to thank you for writing this book. It's absolutely riveting. I could not put it down. I've been doing this work for many years, but it was really outstanding. And it deserves to be publicized by all the churches here. I just saw a film at the Bible Museum last week called Emmanuel about the attack on a church in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a racial attack, but the black Christians in that congregation within 48 hours made a public declaration of forgiveness to the assassin. It struck me as I was reading this book at the same time as I saw that movie that this would be lend itself very well to filming. These 21 have become the face of Christian persecution across the globe. I went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and saw a couple years ago, a big banner that the cops had put up across the roof with this iconic picture on it. And, it struck me then how extraordinary the Coptic Church is for honoring their martyrs, their modern day martyrs, something that our churches here don't do enough of. And so my question is, are you thinking in terms of getting it produced into a film? I think it would be incredible, and the churches should all be behind that.
Would you repeat? Are you thinking that
of turning this book into a movie?
Oh, yes. In a movie?
Yes. Is there any interest in that? Because it really deserves to be seen, at the Bible Museum and everywhere across the globe.
But there is a bad experience if the writer makes the film script by himself. If somebody else would like to do that, I'm ready to do it, but I'm ready to help with it. But I shouldn't do that by myself.
Yes.
Can I just say we are currently already in conversation about something like that. So great.
Very good.
Hello, Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Thank you. I look forward to reading this book as well. And like Nina, I've been doing this for a long time and been following the church in Egypt for a long time. When you talk about forgiveness, it strikes me that the West has no concept at all of what forgiveness actually means. We think that forgiveness means denial, that you deny that something bad has happened and just pretend that it's not there. Or some people have said that extending forgiveness is like somebody saying that they're superior to you, so they don't even like having the concept. But my question is, can you say anything about how you saw this forgiveness that the families offered, that there was, I would assume that they were fully frank about what happened and that the depth of sorrow that it caused them, and yet because of the cross of Christ, they were able to forgive. Thank you.
Well, I would say that there was not so much, we did not speak so much about forgiveness there. They did not talk about the murderers. The murderers were not concerned. They did not look at them. The murderers were for them, I guess, a kind of incarnation of the evil, of the devil, and of the devil never can be forgiven. It is, the murderers had masks, black masks. They had no individuality. They were no persons. They did not want to be persons. And so you can only forgive a person and not a spectre. No, it was the amazing thing was that they were not concerned with what have they done to us, how awful was this. No. This was a story of a big triumph, of a victory. Really, and the question of forgiveness was not so important to these people, at least.
It's not unlike Augustine's notion of evil, which is such an interesting one in Christian doctrine.
Yes.
Where Augustine refuses to give reality to evil. He says, and Aquinas followed this as well, that evil is the absence of good. It's the vacuum. Yeah. That when you're trying to resist evil, Aquinas would say, and Augustine would as well, you focus on the good. Yeah. Because if you focus on the good, the evil is so insignificant that it will be defeated. Yeah. You do not even acknowledge, in a sense, it's the victory that you focus on, and not the...
This was my feeling there. This was my feeling there, yes.
Very interesting. Yes. Okay, here and then back behind you.
Excuse me, I'm Ellen Vaughn, and I'm a writer. And one of the recent books I did was a biography of Mama Maggie, who works in the garbage villages of Cairo. So I was able to travel to Egypt repeatedly and learn a little bit about the Coptic faith in that context. And I saw, Nina, the movie at the Bible Museum as well, a very visceral and powerful demonstration of what forgiveness looks like. I loved your book. I felt like it was very noble, very much a celebration of human dignity. And my question has to do with the very robust nature in the Coptic Church, as I understand it, of martyrdom, and how that is a real and a tangible and an immediate sort of thing that I feel like, as a Protestant in the West, I have no concept of. And it seemed like that was so connected with the heroism of these men. Yeah. There was, we pray for them to be faithful, and they were, and it wasn't a complicated decision. I wonder if you could speak to how in the West could the church gain what the Coptic Church knows in that sense?
Well, our church is we in the Western world we have this Constantinian age. We had this going together, church with society, church with government, church with culture, and so on. And that had rich fruits, of course. The cathedrals, the art, the music, and so on. It is an endless list of great achievements. It's impossible to regret that. But also we lost a bit some essentials. This experience, this necessity of the martyrdom as an essential of Christianity. For it were the martyrs who spread the Christianity. We never have to forget, the martyrs are earlier than the Gospels. When the first martyrs died, the Gospels were not written. and the first conciles who wrote the creeds in Nicaea and in Constantinople, our creeds, they only wrote down what the martyrs before had believed. And so all the authors of the Gospels were martyrs. Martyrdom is in mathematics. You have the proof of the correctness in a formula, and a Christian proof of truth is the readiness to die for it. And this is what in Western Christianity we could forget it. We had it in beautiful paintings, Baroque paintings of the martyrdom of the early Christianity, but not in our countries, not so much. We also had in our, remember in England under Henry VIII, or even in Germany and so on. Also in Christian times, we have some martyrs, but Jeanne d'Arc, for instance, a martyr by the church, by the way, but not so many. They are the exemption, and it is good to see that this is now where the Western Church is in such a crisis and such a decline, in Europe at least. United States may be different. It is good to see that there is still a living church. For as long as there are martyrs, church is living. This is the big comfort for every doubt in modern Christianity.
Yeah. You mentioned the garbage areas of Cairo. You must have really enjoyed the parts of the book where he uses the Copts, scavenging there and living right there in the shadow of that, as another example of what to the world looks impossible, that you could build communities of joy in places of such sorrow and poverty, and yet they somehow do. There was a lady right behind you, yes, that I promised to let speak.
Thank you. My name is Nermeen Riyad from Coptic Orphans. My colleague and I, Sarah, were just in Egypt 2 weeks ago, and we went and visited the Church of the 21 Martyrs. We have the blessing of having the children of the martyrs in our program and supported by Coptic Orphans. But one of the really nice things when I went and visited was the 20 bodies were returned to Egypt. Matthew the Ghanaian was not returned to his country because there was no family to claim him. And so there at the church, they've made a place for him, and they are waiting for Matthew to be reunited with his brothers there at the church. And that really struck me. If you could speak a little bit about how such a situation unites us all as brothers and sisters.
Sort of the relationship of Matthew to the rest of the group.
Yes.
You speculated, for example, in your book a little bit that he may have understood a little English because his face seemed to be a little more aware of what was about to happen.
Yes.
But you did speculate in the book a little bit about how Matthew bonded with that group, or appeared to.
Yes, well, it is speculation. It is, well, of course, first of all, this admiration. How is a man, how must a man be who could be free and says completely voluntarily, no, I'm Christian, I want to go with them. That is so such a mystery that you only can speculate. And what was able to bring him to that. We had in the early martyrdom, we had in the stories of the Diocletian persecutions, we have a similar moment. There is the feast of Saint Felix, and Felix was condemned to death, and while they brought him to the place to kill him, an unknown man came and said, "I want to join him. I believe the same." And we do not know his name, and he is called ad auctus, the augmented, Felix et ad auctus. Because this is the same phenomenon. A kind of baptism by his blood.
Yes, sir. Right here.
Steve Lindquist with International Christian Concern. After a decade plus of visiting with and learning from persecuted Christians around the world, I'm always fascinated with how much they have to teach us. In the three of the Gospels, Jesus says if we're going to be his disciples, we have to take up our cross and follow him.
Yes.
After looking at the lives of these 21, visiting with their families, understanding it would be a supposition, at least at some level, could you attempt to define how you believe they would describe what it means to take up their cross and follow Christ?
I did not completely get it.
In your view, what do you think the 21 or their parents, how would they say what it means to take up your cross and follow Christ? What would that mean to them?
Yes. Well, I had not the idea that taking the cross is something to take something very heavy. And this was not the situation I found these people. They had not as if they had to bear something very heavy, and they bear it, and no, they seemed serene. They seemed free. They seemed completely consolated. It did not seem as if there was as if there were a burden. No, to the contrary, they had received an enormous thing, a saint. It is a reality for them. A saint in the heaven with a crown. I have written, like David, King David comes out of the shepherd's hut. So came here kings out of small peasant huts, and they were looking of them with great pride and relief.
I think that might be a good place to bring this particular part of our program to an end. We're going to take a brief coffee break. You're even allowed to bring your coffee back in here. We're going to start pretty quickly in 10, 12 minutes. So if you could come back quickly. But join me in thanking Martin for his time. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege in this next portion to introduce a couple of very fine speakers, and then we will conclude our time before the reception with a panel discussion. But our first speaker now is Archbishop Angaelos of London, the Coptic Orthodox Archbishop of London. And it was November the 18th, 2017, that His Eminence Archbishop Angaelos was enthroned as the first Coptic Orthodox Archbishop of London. Now, he'd been in London for some time. He'd been a general bishop of the Coptic Orthodox Church in the United Kingdom since 1999. But he was widely recognized for, at that point and ever since, for his remarkable advocacy work. And virtually everything I'm going to say now about His Eminence has to do with this remarkable career of being a voice for those who are in need of support. His advocacy work has resulted in him being conferred the honor of the Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. This was an award given by Her Majesty the Queen for services to international religious freedom. He has also been conferred the Lambeth Cross for Ecumenism by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Coventry Cross of Nails for Reconciliation. He has been the founder and is the convener of the Asylum Advocacy Group, which works very closely in partnership with the All-Parliamentary Party Parliamentary Group on International Religious Freedom Belief. I think in the last few years, the number of conferences that I've been to that he has been is more than I can count on my two hands. Archbishop Angaelos has frequently issued statements and comments related to the situation of religious minorities, particularly in places like the Middle East, but he's visited refugee camps in Greece and Lebanon and Kurdistan and Jordan, and he works tirelessly with those who are trying to make a difference. It's a great honor to have you here to speak to us for a few minutes. Thank you so much for coming.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you for this opportunity. It's quite surreal that across the Atlantic from where I live and where I serve predominantly, and yet I can look across a room and see so many friends and colleagues with whom I have crossed paths in so many different ways. And I'm thankful for all their witness and their work and their tireless efforts for those who are many thousands of miles away, but who still present an importance to them. I've also gotten over these last literally 48 hours to get to know a man for whom I have the greatest respect now, and that is Martin Mosebach, who is not only a wonderful author, but also a great gentleman, and with a heart and a clarity. And that is the indication of his work and how it comes across so well and allows people to live the incidents and experiences of these previously unknown men. And yet he brings them to life so well. I must say, sitting here over the past almost hour and looking at the cover of the book, I became quite uncomfortable. Because this isn't a staged picture. This isn't photoshopped. It's not something an advertising executive came up with. This is a real photograph of real men who were really led to their deaths and who really proclaim their faith to quite literally their very last breath. And so we get a window into what martyrdom and witness means. For many of us, even in my own church, martyrdom is hailed and heralded and celebrated. We read the stories of the martyrs in every liturgy. And yet, it was historic. And we become almost desensitized to it. Whereas we speak about iconography in the church. These men were not only the subjects of an icon that then became quite widespread, but they in themselves became icons. And they continue to be an example of what we live today. Martin said earlier that martyrs pre-existed the Gospels. And if you will allow me, my reflection on that is the martyrs were probably the first Gospels, because they spoke. They spoke of faith, and they personified and embodied that faith. The reason this is happening this week with our dear friends from the Bruderhof community, who have become very good friends over the past years, is that on the 15th, on Friday, is the commemoration not only of the Libya martyrs, but by decree from our own Holy Synod, has now become the annual contemporary martyrs, because we knew from that point that this wasn't the end, this was a beginning. We were going to have more and more martyrs, maybe not on a beachfront in Libya, but in churches in Alexandria and Tanta and Cairo, in villages in Minya and Larish, and in so many other places where Christians have been targeted just for being Christians and for no other reason. And yet, and this is something that makes me very proud, we've never fallen into a state of victimhood. There's no sense of self-sorrowing. In actual fact, it is a badge of honor. Not that we glorify death, but that we glorify life, whether it be here on earth or eternal. And so this was just a portal. It was an entry point into life. And that's what gives us the strength to carry on. We've seen so many instances of attacks, and we've seen such a gracious response. No retaliation, no call for vengeance, no sense of needing revenge. In actual fact, I've heard comments from mothers and daughters and sisters of those who have died, both the Libya martyrs but also others, who have quite openly spoken of forgiveness and have called those who have taken their loved ones to a sense of accountability and to an understanding of the pain that they have left behind. It's interesting, we spoke about the cross earlier, and the cross being a symbol of death and defeat. But we as Christians use it as a sense of defiance and strength. And on this day, one of those who had the big knives stood in the middle and pointed the knife at the camera and called us the nation of the cross, and said subsequently that Coptic Christians were their, and I quote, their favorite prey. They put themselves in the place of predators, and we were going to be prey. Many of you will know Coptic Christians have a tradition of having a cross tattooed. Now, I was brought up in Australia, so I never did this. I didn't have a tattoo. And yet, I was so moved by this incident. I really do think this changed my life. I was so moved when there was this knife pointed, talking to us as the nation of the cross, and thinking that that was going to scare us, that I went and had the tattoo in a sense of defiance. Because that is who we are as Christians. Not aggressive defiance, not violent defiance, but faithful defiance, patient defiance, and resilient defiance. That which comes from the knowledge of our Lord and our Savior. We're here at National Press Club, so of course media is core. And this video was core. It's amazing how God can turn things around. And a tool that was supposed to instigate fear and anxiety and make people turn from their faith, shuddering in their boots and fearful for their lives, actually changed the world. And these 21 men who were unknown are suddenly here after 4 years, gathering us from the four winds. just because of their witness. I'm sure that some advertising executive in the organization was kicking himself because this video that was left to be propagated and spread, leaving even the audio, and the audio had the men calling upon the name of Christ to quite literally their last breath. And that was a tool of outreach and evangelization and evangelism. And the church today is a continuing body. It is the living, breathing body of Christ. There is no division point between history and contemporary and future. It is a continuum. And so we find ourselves living this continuum, bringing together the days of martyrdom to the present experience of martyrdom to the future of the church and how it continues to live. And that is our testimony. That is what we have to present. Their families as well. Resilient, strong, faithful, loving. And we're so thankful to them for giving us a window into their lives. You know, we always say that families of victims of violence must have a time to think and must have a right to privacy. And yet, we don't think of the fact that so many people have said that they've visited the village and visited the homes and visited the families, and they've allowed that because they have become that manifestation of that continuity of that church that is still alive. And that can't be easy, because their sons were made a spectacle of. They were used as pawns. They were staged. They were made as a backdrop. They were props. And yet, it is the power of the men who knelt in those iconic orange jumpsuits that gave them so much visibility, with integrity and faith and honor and power, which far exceeded those who stood above them with knives and masks, because they were visible. Their lives were visible, their example was visible, their faith was visible. They continue to be a manifestation of that life. And so we, as Christians, have a responsibility. And that responsibility is to never forget. The Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 4, verse 18, speaks of our Lord being a chief advocate. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, sent me to heal the brokenhearted, proclaim liberty to those captives, recovery of sight to the blind. All of that, that's what we're here for, to advocate. I see a manifestation here of policymakers, advocates, development agencies, so many other realms of academia and journalism. And if we do not merge our efforts here and today and now and work collaboratively, we will continue to work in our own silos and not get very far. And yet if the energy in this room and so many rooms like it around the world over the years comes together, we'd be so much more able to focus on the religious freedom. So as a bishop in the church, as a clergyman, I know that advocacy is my calling, as it is for many of you. And I assure you it is not an advocacy just for Coptic Christians. Because my God created me equal to everybody else and gave me, like everybody else, a freedom to believe or not believe. And so when he came to present and call salvation to all and makes his sun shine and his rain fall on the just and the unjust equally, so too must our eyes be on that freedom for all equally. And without tribalism. And so we continue to speak truth to power. It's a wonderful comment that we all know, and yet how often do we do it? Because speaking the truth sometimes comes at a price. but we still must continue to do it. I have 3 pet projects in my life, and I'm going to harp on about them until something happens. The first is, just as we detest and deplore and speak against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we must also realize that the attacks on Christians are actually a phenomenon. They're not just sporadic acts. They are a phenomenon as much as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And so we need to think of a word that we all agree on. And use that word. And introduce what we are going through as a phenomenon of targeted attacks on Christians, just for being Christians. The second thing, whether we're speaking about the Christians of Egypt, or Iraq, or Syria, or Libya, or the Palestinian territories, we are not just speaking about religious minorities, we are speaking about indigenous people. If this would have happened to the indigenous Indian population in the US, or the Aborigines of Australia, would the world have been silent? And yet, because there is a religious element to it, it is sometimes shelved on a different shelf. But they are indigenous people, with a right not only to life, but to dignity. Being alive is not a gift from anyone. It is a gift from God. And dignity is something we are all entitled to. And my last project is that of collaboration, working together, coordinating. I've seen so much happen, and it's so good, but it is so fragmented. It is time for us to come together. It is time for us to have a coalition. Let's not have big conferences or big titles. Let's just get together and work. And let's create a link that is transatlantic between these 2 great cities of London and Washington, and work for those who are farther afield. In conclusion, and sorry, this is an occupational hazard, I'd like to conclude with Scripture. St. Paul's second epistle to the Corinthians, chapter 4. We are hard-pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but certainly not destroyed.
Thank you so much for those words. It's my great privilege to introduce a friend and a colleague, somebody who's very close to the Religious Freedom Institute, who is a scholar of note and does some wonderful work. I'm talking about Mariz Tadros, who is a professor of politics and development at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK. She's also the director of something called CREED, which is the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development. And it's a newly established, multi-partner, multi-country, 4-year program, which is funded by the UK Department of International Development, or DFID, which is the equivalent of USAID in the UK. It's addressing how poverty reduction efforts can actively redress religious inequalities and support inclusive, religiously diverse communities, promote the benefits of interdependence among people beyond religious and non-religious lines. There's a whole list of wonderful books that Mariz has written. I'm just going to mention a couple. One is that she's the author of The Muslim Brotherhood in Contemporary Egypt. That was in 2012. She's written the book Copts at the Crossroads, the challenge of building an inclusive democracy in contemporary Egypt. That's 2013. She's written on resistance, revolt, and gender justice, 2016. She's very busy. I don't know when she has the time to teach. She's editor of Women in Politics. And I also want to mention this, the co-editor of Christianity in North Africa and West Asia. And I think that has a copy on the front of that is the icon. Is that the icon of the 21 who we have been remembering today. So we're just delighted to have you here and to make remarks.
Thank you, Kent. It's always such a privilege and honor to be here, and a very hearty thank you to RFI, Religious Freedom Institute, for inviting me. I will build a little bit, some comments on two things. His Grace Archbishop Angaelos talked about lest we forget, and that's very important, the power of memory. And I will relate it to another kind of violence. We saw here physical violence. But in academia, there's something very interesting called epistemic violence, the violence of knowledge, the violence of how you tell the story, what you keep out of the story, what you retain out of the story, and what it means for history. And that is the challenge that I will take on this morning in relating the incident of the 21 in the broader context of religious pluralism in Egypt and the question of how do we avoid forgetting and how do we tell the story in a way that honors those that have paid with their blood. I will relate this work within the context of the fact that I spend probably no less than 70% of the year in Egypt, in grassroots communities in Upper Egypt, in particular in relation to the program CREED that Kent mentioned, but also in another initiative that is supported by the British Council on training young people in Upper Egypt to capture and document their own people's history, their own history in their own words. And within that context, I will talk about how do we address the question of lest we forget through challenging and redressing the politics of denial. Because what I will do now is I will probably make maybe few people a little bit uncomfortable about challenging some Western mainstream narratives regarding how the story of religious encroachments is being shared. Now, I will speak about the three kinds of denials or three kinds of omissions in those stories. The first is the question of the denial of why these 21 were targeted. Immediately after the news came out of their beheading, we had some talk about the beheading of Egyptians by one particular international human rights organization. I'd be happy to share with you in confidence which one, where they talked about the beheading of Egyptians. Others who talked about the assault on economic migrants. Others who talked about their vulnerability because they couldn't get to the truck drivers. The issue here is not that Egyptians don't face violence, because of course they have. And the issue here is not that economic migrants and Africans who have been in Libya, poor Africans searching for jobs or going on the path to seeking refugee status elsewhere, have not faced enormous difficulties, because of course they have. And the issue isn't that truck drivers haven't had problems when they've crossed borders. But the issue here is the denial of the fact that these 21 have been assaulted and targeted because they are Christian. And that is particularly serious, because what we saw as a consequence of this denial is the fact that part of how they were identified as Christians was kept out of the story. Bishop Angaelos referred to his tattoo. But we have now a corroboration of evidence from different sources that the militia, whether it's ISIS or others, went into people's homes and actively asked people to roll up their sleeves, because a lot of Christians have tattoos of saints on their arms from Upper Egypt or the cross. And interestingly, that is often how they also identified Ethiopian Christians, and Amnesty International tells us in one of its reports some of the Nigerians as well. So why is this denial of why they are targeted so serious and so important for all of us to address? 3 reasons. First of all, because if you don't know why people are targeted, you will assume preventative measures that are ill-measured. In other words, you will say, well, let us improve economic opportunities in Egypt. Of course, we must do so, but that is not why they were targeted. You will say, well, let us remove the categorization of religion on ID cards. That's an excellent idea, but that's not why they were targeted. So that's the first reason. The second reason is because it denies people their identity. If you know you have been assaulted because you're a Copt and you become proud of it, don't take away people's pride. Don't take away people's identity by negating it. It does not mean that they're not very proud of being Egyptians as well. In fact, when the church in their honor was built in Egypt, it was called the Church of the Nation and Martyrs. So it was to be a source of pride to all Egyptians. But don't deny them that sense of honor by negating who they are. The second kind of denial that I would like to engage with, which again we all have to address through our work, is the denial of what I call the politics of revenge. Now, people would say, and this is very common among some mainstream Western narratives, that this despicable act has no link whatsoever with the acts of other militias or the acts of the ultra-radical Salafis in Egypt or even the Muslim Brotherhood. But here I would ask everyone, lest we forget. Let's go back to June 2013, when Egyptians, Muslims, and Christians rose against the Muslim Brotherhood. These were Muslims who were telling the Muslim Brotherhood, you do not represent Islam. We are Muslims and you do not represent us. In those days before the uprising of June 2013, we have this documented. I mean, it is visually as well as audio documented. We have a number of members of the Muslim Brotherhood leadership as well as members of the ultra-radical Salafis telling Copts, addressing their words to Copts, should you go and join the protests, you will see your churches burnt, you will see your property destroyed, and we will avenge this. And that's exactly what followed. Between June and August 2013, no less than 80 places of worship, faith-based organizations, in addition to the private property, were assaulted and torched. Interestingly, and this is where this is not just about two desperate acts, but this is about the continuity of acts of revenge and vendetta on Copts. When I was doing interviews and focus groups with young men and women in Minya in December 2018, they said to me that after every single terrorist act that they have seen, when they engage with some of those that have links with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis in Minya, they tell them, you deserve it. Didn't you go out and protest against President Morsi? Didn't we tell you this will happen to you? You deserve what is happening to you. Now, live it. This is extremely important because that is the narrative of revenge that didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi threats, really, to the Copts and those that supported them in 2013. Now, you might ask, well, why again is this important? It's important because we need to understand that those that condone terrorist attacks must be held accountable. Those that tell the Copts in Minya, you deserve it, should be held accountable for hate speech. And it's important because we need to challenge this discourse that the Muslim Brotherhood and other Salafis never condoned violence against Copts. Because that is part of the historical reality that we need to engage with. And please, 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 let nobody say, well, we're being Islamophobic, because I want to emphasize that a lot of the Muslims have stood by the Christians in these terrorist attacks and have said, we are heartfelt sorry for what you are going through. You are our brothers and sisters. And in fact, in my documentation of the torching of churches in Minya, in every single story that these young people that were training to collect the histories, there were always Muslims who actually went and tried to stop the torching of the churches. In fact, in one case in Minya, one Muslim man died, putting through a fire, and he is now being honored in the Coptic Evangelical Church in that particular community. His picture is being put in that church as a martyr. So it is not about Christians versus Muslims. It is about particular political forces that seek to hijack and seek to manipulate agendas. So that's very important for how we tell the story. But again, let's not forget those who are responsible for hate speech, for her saying, just last December, after the last terrorist attack in the monastery of St. Samuel, you deserve it. We have to stop this hate speech. Now, the third kind of denial, which is extremely important and which I think the launch of the book is such an important measure to redress the denial that I'm about to speak to, is the denial of public tribute and recognition. Some kinds of recognition are not just in economic terms, as important as economic aspects are. They're not just in political terms, as important as politics is. They are in psychological terms. Now, when the Copts, when these Copts were martyred, on the 16th of March 2015, the Prime Minister, on behalf of the President, announced that in tribute to the martyrs, there will be the state has granted permission for a new church to be built in Al-Aur, which had the largest number of martyrs in Minya, in that same place in their honor. Now, immediately after that, a number of Salafis started mobilizing, saying, not on our dead body should we have this church here in our town. On the 27th of March 2015, one of the biggest protests erupted in Al-Aur with some very serious physical violence occurring against some Copts, led by the Salafis against the establishment of that church. And they said, why do you need that church? How can you see these? And their logic was, how can these people be recognized as martyrs when they died because they denied the Muslim faith? That was their logic. We cannot recognize them as martyrs when the reason for their martyrdom was that they refused to enter the Muslim faith. Now, may I also say that a lot of the Muslims in Al-Aur were also against this. This was the Salafi-led kind of action because we had not seen violence between Christians and Muslims in that village up to that point. This is very important because it had three implications. The first implication is it took more than 6 months for that church to start to be built, because they kept on stalling it under the basis that we cannot have this in our village. The second seriousness of that situation was the deprivation, the attempted deprivation of the Copts of just being recognized by the people as martyrs. And that was particularly psychologically, that was a kind of psychological violence that was particularly serious and which we have to recognize. Finally, it made the possibilities of restorative justice in that village particularly challenging. So where does this lead us? I think it leads us to the importance of challenging hate speech, online or offline, in the media or through other means, through the mobile phone or through satellite television. And that's one of the things that our program, Creed, will be doing across many contexts. But it also helps us to remember that the best way to address with lest we forget is to make sure that history gets told in ways that doesn't disempower and doesn't negate and doesn't omit, because that is a kind of epistemic violence. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mariz. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce the man who leads the United States policy of advancing international religious freedom, Ambassador Sam Brownback. I won't detail his bio, which you have in your programs, except to say that he was a United States Senator when the International Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1998 and was one of its most vocal champions. There's a simple reason for that, which you're going to find out in a moment. Sam Brownback lives and breathes religious freedom. It's in his DNA. He talks about it with passion and eloquence, but the thing that's most impressive about Ambassador Brownback is that he does more than talk. He acts. One of his first acts when he became ambassador last year was to convince the Secretary of State to do something that had never been done, namely to conduct a U.S. ministerial, a gathering of foreign ministers and their delegations on the subject of advancing religious freedom. Not only had it never been done, it was risky, but he brought it off, along with his colleagues in the Office of International Religious Freedom, and it was a resounding success. It was so successful that we're set to have this July a second and a bigger and a more ambitious ministerial. So stay tuned. These ministerials show that Ambassador Brownback is not just issuing reports and making speeches, as important as those things are. He's working to convince foreign governments that religious freedom is in their interests, for example, by contributing to their economic development or undermining the terrorism that is destabilizing their societies. I believe he's making a profound contribution to the fight against mounting international religious persecution and to the cause of advancing the right of religious freedom for all people. Let me emphasize that final point. America stands for the religious freedom of everyone. Ambassador Brownback has delivered that message personally. His first trip as ambassador was to Bangladesh to visit the refugee camps where Rohingya Muslims had fled from Myanmar after savage persecution from the regime there. With this visit, he delivered a powerful message. In America, we stand with the persecuted of every creed and every nation, including Muslims and Buddhists and Yazidis and Jews and, yes, Christians. We will not, in America, remain spectators in the face of mounting global assaults on human dignity or on any religious group, whether those assaults are by mobs, terrorists, or governments. We will speak and we will act. Mr. Ambassador, we're grateful to your service for our country and to those millions around the world who are suffering religious persecution. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Ambassador Brownback.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate that very much, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks, Religious Freedom Institute, National Press Club, for hosting this event. I think most of us remember this event happening. I know at the time I was governor in Kansas, and one of the pastors, local pastors, he talked about it that Sunday. Everybody in the crowd knew exactly what he was talking about. This is one of those events that went global, and in a very profound way. It wasn't just an image that people had, it was an imprint they got. It was an imprint they got in their heart that this thing is wrong, this is bad, and I'm not going to take it. This is something I think is absolutely wrong in the world, and we're going to fight it. We're going to oppose it. And I'm delighted to see the book coming out and to press this on forward. This is a major topic for the Trump administration on religious persecution. Tom mentioned about the ministerial this last year. It wasn't my idea. It was started. I pushed it on forward. It happened. It is going to happen this year, July 16th to 18th. We hope you'll join us. And I think we'll have an event triple the size of last year because we're pressing it hard, and we're getting a number of countries around the world to join as well. We're also doing regional events. We'll have one in the UAE coming up February 23rd and 24th. I want to make sure I've got my dates right on that. If I don't, somebody correct me real quickly. those dates, and that's going to be on textbook material, and making sure that textbooks don't pillar one faith or another, because we're finding in too many countries that the textbooks will favor the majority religion and say the minority religion, this is a very bad thing. And that's terrible for a country to do if they want to have religious freedom, if they want to have religious diversity. This is a bad thing to do. Then I'm going to Taiwan. We'll do one of these events in Asia on a religious freedom civil society effort, and that one's taking place March 11th and 12th. And these are events I hope people will attend, that they're interested in, and we'll pursue those. Today, though, we in particular remember the heinous beheading of 21 men on a beach in Libya, executed and filmed by ISIS and disseminated on a video on the internet, as I stated, that went around the world and touched souls. We condemn this massacre of Egyptian Christians with sorrow upon sorrow. 20 souls were added that day on the long list of Copts martyred for their faith in their long history. Since that time, more than 300 Muslims were massacred at a mosque in Sinai, and more than 100 other Copts have been killed in terrorist attacks. Now, I said 20 Copts. The initial report was of 21 Copts that were killed. Investigations later led to believe that a subsequent report that one of those murdered was a man from Ghana. According to some sources, this man, a man named Matthew, was not originally a Christian, but he saw the immense faith of the others. And when the terrorists came to him and they asked him if he rejected Jesus, if they would, if he did, they'd spare his life. They asked him the same question they'd asked the Copts, and he reportedly said, "Their God is my God," and was killed as well. So today we remember the 21 men who were beheaded in Libya by ISIS for nothing more than professing their faith. Their steadfastness in the faith is an inspiration to us all, and they serve as examples to all those around the world who courageously seek to live out their faith peacefully, even in the face of great persecution. They also remind us of everything that's good about religion and about faith, a living and active faith that changes lives and changes souls within us. Their faith lives on today and is shared by many others around the world. These persons represent the cornerstone of our nations, and we must do a better job of protecting their right to religious freedom. I love the line, and I've used this before, and some of you have heard me say it, but I just think it's so perfect. Mother Teresa once was quoted as saying that she says, "I love all faiths. It's the search for God. I'm in love with my own." And just that thought of the respect for people of faith, that they're just seeking to passionately and purposely and peacefully pursue something that's deep within them, the search for God. And we should all respect that, we should honor it, and that right should be protected. The answer to religious conflict, or conflict that's based on some reading or deviation from religion, the answer to religious conflict is religious freedom. The answer to religious conflict is religious freedom. So you guarantee for the right for everybody else to practice their faith, or no faith at all, to practice it freely and in a way that they are secure, that they're not attacked for simply practicing their faith. And if we want less religious conflict, if we want less conflict, if we want less terrorism in the world, the answer is religious freedom. Protect and guarantee the right. And we should push and pursue this around the world. These martyrs that we recognize today remind us that we must step up and get in the fight for religious freedom and a respect for one another's faith. They remind us that others around the world are in need of our prayers, our voice, our influence. We cannot be bystanders in the face of oppression. This is why promoting religious freedom worldwide is a priority for this administration and why we are fighting this battle on all fronts. Religious freedom is a universal human right that must be protected everywhere. This is of great urgency. Fortunately, alliances on the left and right are coming together internationally to stand for this right and against those who would limit it or deny it altogether. Our words must be joined with our actions. It means a more national approach and I believe global approach to pursuing religious freedom, seeking partnerships with, in particular, business community, security community, foreign policy, media, and foreign aid efforts to pursue protections for this freedom, so that these topics are integrated into all of those fields. It is, of course, means that we have strong diplomatic pressure to motivate other countries to hold accountable perpetrators of crimes targeting people for their faith. Now let me get to the point of a couple ways you can be involved in this effort, and I hope you will. Every Tuesday, just had one today, 11 to noon, I host an International Religious Freedom Roundtable, usually on the Hill. More than 100 people came today and regularly come, of all different faiths or no faith at all, to pursue and to put forward the problems of religious persecution that are happening in their part of the world that they know about, and to share that and to try to galvanize and get others to involve in their effort. If you're interested in getting involved in this work, come and see a place that you can plug in. Find a community that you want to support or a group of people that you want to support and plug into it. We just started today a new project that I'm hopeful can bear fruit, a group from northern Iraq, and it was a local Episcopalian priest that had started this, where he had gotten really motivated to help one of the Christian persecuted communities in northern Iraq. Started raising some money to help rebuild some houses in this particular area. I said, let's take that on a broader basis. Let's host a meeting of private groups, parishes, civil society groups, to start focusing on different communities in northern Iraq, or it's in various other communities around the world, and help those connect to help rebuild these communities. And we're going to host a group to do that. Call attention to religious persecutions in places where people aren't free to practice their faith. Each of you have outlets to be able to reach out. This event's a good example of that. We need a grassroots movement to really take root. We need people all over the world and all over the planet, all over our country, caring about this issue and driving support of those in need. And finally, it's already been mentioned, but I want to reiterate it. Secretary Pompeo will again host this year a ministerial to advance religious freedom, where we will invite foreign ministers from around the world to Washington, to the United States, July 16th to 18th at State Department, to discuss religious freedom and what can be done as a global community for us to press this topic on forward. There will be many events in town that week to highlight this issue. We're asking groups to host sidebar events, to put forward, this is what's happening in our community, or this is something that we're particularly interested in. Last year, I think we had 30 sidebar events. I hope we have as many or more this year, and invite the media and other people to those, so that what is happening in your particular community can be known and can be put forward on a broader basis. Last year, we had delegates from over 80 foreign countries. We hope to have more there this year. We had 500 civil society representatives, roughly. I think we can double or triple the size of that, of bringing people together for it. I'd encourage you, host more meetings or conferences or seminars like this, here or in other places, on the topic of religious freedom, one that you're passionate about, and particularly with a particular group in focus. It's a broad topic, but it's best discussed focused on what happened to somebody or some group. People don't react to numbers. They react to a story. They react to something that happened to somebody. They react to what happened here, what they saw happened to 21 men. They react to that. And to bring that out in that story, and unfortunately, there are a number of different stories like this. There are a group of Chinese faith followers that are coming together, and these are people that are Uyghurs, Muslims, Chinese house church leaders, Falun Gong movement, Tibetan Buddhist, and others that have all come together, formed a group, saying, here is what is happening to us of religious persecution in China today. It's not just the Uyghurs, although it is the Uyghurs. It's not just the house church, although it is the house church. It's not just Falun Gong, but it is them. And they're coming together, and they're going to put together, I hope, a press conference here with pictures behind them of people from their faith community saying, this is happening to us today in China. And pushing hard and letting the world know this isn't just one community, it's everybody. And why? We just peacefully seek to practice our faith. What is wrong with that? Why are we being persecuted for this? And draw support for that. And as we bind together people of all faith or no faith, but around the notion that religious freedom is a guaranteed human right that we should have, but we don't get to practice in most of the world, we will draw strength from that. This movement will move forward. The attack on religious pluralism and diversity of thought will be a defining issue of our time. We need all of you in this room and those following this topic to engage, to be active and coordinate with the broader religious freedom community. We can and must do more. We can and will be successful. We need your effort. By God's grace, life does always triumph over death. Freedom always does overcome oppression. And faith extinguishes fear. It always does. It always will. It can be painful getting there. This is the source of our hope and our confidence in the future. Thank you for being here. God bless you all.
My name is Jeremy Barker. I'm a senior program officer here at the Religious Freedom Institute. And in the final part of our program, we have a panel discussion aiming to try to bring together these threads and look at the policy implications and then recommendations for action. And to do that, we have an esteemed group of panelists. I'll introduce them briefly and then ask them to come to the stage. First is Samuel Tadros, a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution and a senior fellow at Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom, and particularly relevant for today's conversation, the author of Motherland Lost, the Egyptian and Coptic Quest for Modernity. So Samuel will be joining us. Second is Shadi Hamid, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for Middle East Policy, a astute analyst of both the Middle East and U.S. politics, the author of or co-editor with Will McCants of Rethinking Political Islam, and the author of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. And then our third panelist, again joining us on the stage, will be His Eminence Archbishop Angaelos, the Coptic Archbishop of London. So let me ask the three of them to join me on the stage. First, and then Archbishop, and you all the way on the end. Right next. This, the next one. Yeah, okay. All right, so this has been a heavy conversation so far. A lot of talk of martyrdom and victimhood and yet resilience and hope. I want to open, Sam, with you. And you wrote an article in December in which you said, very few today would argue that Middle East Christianity is not facing an existential crisis. Then you went historically and drew a number of threads together and came up to kind of the present day. We've heard some of that today, but unpack that a little bit for us. What's the existential crisis and some of the drivers behind that?
Well, thank you first for having me on the panel and for organizing this excellent event so far. It's the third time to be with His Grace on a panel, so that's always a pleasure. And it's the first time to be with Shadi on a panel, despite the fact that both of us have written about similar topics and areas of interest. In anticipation, of course, of the fireworks, they put the bishop in the middle to mediate. So let me pick on where Professor Mariz Tadros stopped the story of the attack, not in Libya, but in the village of the Martyrs of Al-Awr. The president of Egypt, immediately after the attack, had ordered airstrikes in Libya. It was a nice show of the Egyptian state is there to defend all of its citizens. It didn't escape observers the fact that they hit a very different group than the one that actually killed the people in Libya. But it was a nice show of Egyptian support. He paid a visit to the Coptic cathedral, and most importantly, he promised that church to be built in the village of Al-Awr, where 13 out of the 20 martyrs had come from. The fact that a church being built needed a president to grant it indicates part of the problem here. For building churches in Egypt is extremely problematic. In fact, before 2005, not just building a church, building a bathroom in a church in Egypt, building a wall of a church required the president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak at the time, to sign a presidential decree granting us the bathroom. I remember my grandfather and elders of the Christian community where I come from in the Delta signing that petition for President Mubarak to give us this bathroom in the village of Quwisna in Munufeya in the Delta. But the president granted that church. The mob immediately was angry and refused a church being built. This would dishonor them. Now here the state faced a problematic situation. Usually when such events occur, when the mob gathers and starts attacking Christians, and we're talking here about the mob, just immediately after the Libya massacre, where supposedly all Egyptians are torn by what happened, attacking the very homes of the families that lost members in Libya. Molotov cocktails, stones, attacking the homes of those families. So usually what happens in these situations is the state decides to hold a reconciliation session and no church would be built. In fact, just a week after this event, a similar attack takes place in the village next door, 7 kilometers from it, in El Gala village, and that's exactly what happens. They deny them the church. And here, in this situation, of course, President Sisi himself had promised it. So the result was that they decided to build a church outside of the village outskirts. So to balance between the word of the president of Egypt and his promise, and between the pressure of the mob and the intolerance that they had. If we want to understand the challenge of Christianity in Egypt and the broader Middle East, it's the intersection of these three players and factors. It is ISIS, who butchered them on the beach in Libya, but other groups as well. Ones that do not engage in actual killing, but perhaps participate in the incitement that lead to this killing. It is also that of the mob, the growing intolerance that has become so common amongst people, local people, neighbors, normal people, people you go to work with, that you live next door to. And it is the role of the regimes. In this case, the regime that refuses to punish attacks on Copts that take place in Egypt's villages. We've had around 500 mob attacks in the last 5-6 years in Egypt, and not a single one of these was someone taken to court and punished for that attack. So these three players, each of them plays a very different role, but it's the intersection of these three players that makes the reality of life for Middle East Christians so challenging on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think, those three players, the regimes, governments, the mob, and then the presence of extremist ISIS as just one of the most visible representations of that, but that broader phenomena. Shadi, Sam in his opening focused kind of largely on the Christian community, the Christian experience. What's your analysis of kind of the state of pluralism more broadly, not just as it pertains to Christians, but civil society more broadly, and perhaps these three factors?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So the first thing that I would say is, authoritarian regimes have done a very good job in the Middle East of instrumentalizing minorities, instrumentalizing issues of religious freedom, and appealing to Western audiences. So they've gotten more authoritarian, more repressive on a number of different indicators, but they still think that they can come to Western countries, Western policymakers, people like us, and say, hey, at least we're better on religious freedom or religious pluralism, and better for Christian rights, Christian minority rights, and so on. And I think that one thing we have to be careful about that for a number of reasons. One of them, And it's something that I've been thinking about more also in light of the recent visit of the Pope to the UAE, which got a lot of plaudits. But one question that I would pose to the group is, can authoritarian regimes which are inherently suspicious of dissent and free inquiry ever really be champions of religious freedom and religious pluralism? Can you have religious pluralism without political pluralism? Or can you have religious tolerance without political tolerance? I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's possible almost by definition. Because for true religious freedom and pluralism, you need to have competing ideas, and you need to allow ideas that challenge the state or challenge whatever government happens to be in power. So this would apply to regimes like Egypt's regime, which even on its own, even on the terms that we're talking about here, isn't that good on minority rights or Christian rights or religious pluralism anyway. We can disagree perhaps on how bad it is, but it's not particularly good. So even on its own terms of being better on religious freedom, it's not particularly good. Now, to kind of extend that point a little bit, I would say that there's a danger. I think we lose something by cordoning off these categories of Christian rights, and this could also apply to any minority: Christian rights, Shia rights, Muslim rights. As an American Muslim myself, I'm a minority here, and Muslims are minorities in a number of contexts, or even women's rights. So the list goes on. And I think the danger of kind of making these separate categories is that in a way, it denies that minorities want or deserve the same rights that the majorities have or the majorities deserve in particular countries. So if you take an example like Egypt, Christians are affected just like their Muslim counterparts by the lack of freedom, by political repression, by the inability to choose their own leaders, by the inability to join NGOs and do so without fear of persecution. So Christians can't vote for the president in a meaningful election. Christians can't join NGOs without fear of government persecution. The list goes on. So these things shouldn't be seen as applying to only Muslims or Christians. They affect all Egyptians, and they would affect all Jordanians in European context. They would affect Muslims and non-Muslims, where Muslims are minorities, so on and so forth. So I think that in that sense, there's a danger of this narrow framing, and we have to make sure that we're remembering that there is a necessity of focusing on minority rights, but we can't forget that minority rights are a subset of a broader category called human rights that everyone should enjoy equally, and those include not just religious worship or private worship, they also include political rights and political freedoms. And as I said earlier, I don't really think that those two things can be disentangled, especially in contexts in the Middle East, which are religiously conservative societies, not just with Muslims, but also Christians to one degree or another, where the idea that religion is a category and politics is a category is itself a bit problematic, because the two are in very complex ways intertwined. And they're inevitably intertwined, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And Archbishop Angaelos, you mentioned about in kind of talking about some of your pet projects, the danger of siloing off into various groups, but also the framing of religious minorities, but missing the presence of these communities as indigenous populations, the people who have been there. And that speaks a little bit to what Shadi is getting at of religious minority rights issues are part of broader questions of how we're living together in shared spaces in a shared nation. How do you think about that, and what are kind of some of the implications of the very fraught relations that we see in Egypt, but more broadly in the region as well?
First of all, I wasn't aware of the potential buffer situation within here, so I'm thankful for the opportunity to know that. The other problematic position I find myself in is if I say things are okay, then I am pro-government, and if I say things are not okay, then I am anti-government. And I assure you what I'm doing here is giving you an informed view of what I think based on my experience, not being an agent of the government, but also not being an activist. I am an advocate. It's good to have the macro. It's good to always talk about the general situations and general policies. But when matters become existential, we need to focus on the micro. And so, of course, we talk about general rights, human rights. That's right to do. And there's usually a consistency between violations of one and the other. But we must focus on those who are most vulnerable first. And we must focus on the idea that there must be a programmatic and proactive way of creating social cohesion and a sense of citizenship. We saw it post-September 11 in the US and around the world, where there was a programmatic and intentional of saying Muslims are not all bad. Islam is not the cause of this. And it had to be said. Not just to have people formulate their own understanding and decisions, but it had to be a way of safeguarding a community. So when we speak about indigenous peoples, I think there is that same understanding that is needed. There is also to be said for grassroots operations. You know, we spoke about wonderful things about, you know, the Muslim man who goes to save a church that's being burnt and loses his own life. About Muslims in a rural setting trying to stand amongst Christians and vice versa. But there's only so far that grassroots can go. And what we need to see is an intentional program of recognition of people and their rights. And, you know, Egypt and everywhere else needs to develop. We all need to develop. I mean, we have human rights violations, minority violations everywhere in the world, including so-called developing and developed countries. And so this is not a targeted and localized problem anyway. But we also must realize that this is all a process. And as long as we can see milestones, steps, then that should encourage us. But if we're expecting to see great change very quickly, that's usually cosmetic and will usually come to a very quick end.
Yeah. What, Sam, maybe from your perspective, what are some of the steps that programmatic steps at building social cohesion might look like either on the cultural level or perhaps on the political level? And Shadi, we may come to you as well.
Maybe 3 years ago, a Christian journalist, Caroline Kamel in Egypt, wrote an article that created an uproar. She said the story, she got engaged, and her colleagues came to congratulate her. And one of them, a female, said, you know, I've had this question I've always wanted to ask some Christian, and I didn't know anyone close enough. Where's your husband going to spend the first night? And Caroline was confused. What do you mean? You think he's going to run away from me from the first night? She said, I mean, after once, twice, 3 times, where's he going to spend the night when the priest is with you? Her colleague, an educated person, journalist, believed that Christian women granted the priest the right of first night. When she wrote that article, she received thousands of comments, all people sharing different theories they had heard. Christian priests, Coptic priests, wore black because they were sad that Islam ruled Egypt. They will wear white once it's gone. We closed the lights on New Year's Eve because men and women kissed each other secretly in church. What's most remarkable about these stories is that they come from a population that has lived together for 1,400 years, where there is no ethnic divisions. Egypt's Muslims are the descendants of Copts who converted at various moments in time to Islam, where there is no ghettoization or separate areas similar to how the Yazidis or the Kurds or Mesopotamia and the Levant in general, of populations that have lived next to each other and frankly know absolutely nothing about the Christians that they live with. That's shocking, that's remarkable. It's not shocking when you realize that Christianity is completely wiped out from Egyptian textbooks. That Egyptian history being taught is very easy and simple. I mean, you get the pharaohs, Alexander the Great comes, then the Romans, and then there's this 300-year gap where nothing basically happens until Islam comes. And even under Islam, when the population, I mean, it took centuries for the population to shift to a Muslim majority population, the life of that population doesn't exist at all. It is not shocking when we realize that Christianity is wiped out from the public square in all other forms and shapes. That in the Egyptian media, Christianity is not visible. In all of these things, Christianity is not there. So the first thing I would say is, well, education. Change this. Tell the people about their history. Copts are not asking for something special treatment or protection. They are asking for basic equality with other Egyptians. Teach our history. It's Egypt's history. Egyptians should be proud by the fact that monasticism was born at the hands of an Egyptian, Saint Anthony the Great. That it was Saint Athanasius that played such an instrumental role in the history of Christianity. That's part of Egypt's heritage and should be part of its pride. Instead of kids in Egypt street spitting on Coptic priests when they see them, and I've heard horrible stories from priests telling about how they ask their wives and daughters to walk on the other side of the pavement so that they don't see their dad being humiliated. Take the kids from a young age to take one of those school trips and visit a local church. Let them see the church as a normal thing. Let them see that we don't practice black magic inside that church. Let them see us as normal Egyptians just like them.
Yeah, that need for understanding that despite kind of the shared geographic space, actually sharing cultural spaces. Shadi, I know you've written some about there's perhaps a space for theologically rich Muslim and Christian engagement, not kind of lowest common denominator interfaith space, but actually engaging in a more robust space. Are there examples of that you've seen, or kind of what led you? Yeah, does that fit into what Sam's talking about the need for actually understanding?
Yeah, sure. Well, so first of all, I feel like there's a bit of pressure on me because I'm trying to think of something to disagree with Sam on after the expectations were raised so much at the start.
We can get there.
Maybe we will, yeah. But I can't find any fault in anything Sam has said. So I'll get to that. One thing I want to say about what the Archbishop said, which I think is really important, is that when politics or when life becomes existential, it changes. So I'm kind of this outside analyst, and we can take the longer view. We look at the longer term considerations. The problem with the existential context of the Middle East is that when things are existential, you're thinking about survival, and you'll do whatever you can to ensure your survival in the short term, even if it's not the best strategy in a longer term sense. And I think we saw this to Egypt's detriment, and in 2013 in particular, where there was a perception that only one side could win, or that it was quite literally the winner takes all. And we see then groups withdrawing into themselves, and this applies for pretty much everyone. And that's a very dangerous dynamic. So then the bigger question, I think, for us is, how do we minimize the existential stakes of politics in Egypt and the broader Middle East? I mean, I have ideas on that, and I think the only way you can do that in the long run is by promoting normal political disagreements. You have to normalize disagreements and difference instead of penalizing difference. And I think the Egyptian regime, not just under Sisi, but since 1952, has penalized difference. And the question is if Egypt can really move beyond that, where there is a true pluralism that covers both the religious and the political. I'm not optimistic, but that to me is how we kind of, and that's why also I think I guess we're all originally Egyptian here, I guess.
Except for me.
Except for you, but and I'm born and raised here, but my relatives in Egypt would tell me, Shadi, you come here and you talk about democracy and respecting democratic outcomes and the right of Islamist parties to participate, but we're the ones who have to live with the consequences of elections. And almost all my family in Egypt was very, very pro-Sisi. And that led to a lot of tensions in our family because I was critical of Sisi and critical of the military intervention in politics. But I do sort of understand where they were coming from because they're the ones who have to live in Egypt. They're the ones who have to experience whatever comes next. And I do think that is a different way of maybe, there are different ways of kind of looking at the broader picture there. In terms of Muslim-Christian dialogues, which I've been involved in the U.S. context, I'm trying to think about whether the way I think about that here in the U.S. might be applicable in Egypt, and I'm sure it is in some way. But one thing that I've talked about is there's a kind of tendency to have these lowest common denominator, fluffy interfaith dialogues, which are totally predictable. You get a bunch of people in a room who are all basically liberal and open-minded, so liberal Jews, liberal Christians, and liberal Muslims, and of course they're pretty much going to agree on things. To me, the point of any kind of dialogue, and not just interfaith dialogue, is how do we take foundational differences? So that has to be the starting point, that there are people who disagree on profound things having to do with, in a way, existential questions, the role of religion in public life, the relationship between religion and the state. You get them in a room and you figure out where those differences are, and you try to transcend those differences in some way. One very quick example, I remember when I was speaking at an evangelical conference, long story why, but it was in Nashville, and there were like 1,800 evangelicals, and like me, the one Muslim. And after the talk, this old guy came up to me and asked me, "Can I shake your hand?" And I said, "Sure." We shook hands, and he said, "That was the first time I've ever shaken hands with a Muslim." So I was like, "Oh, this is going in a good direction." But then, as if to kind of caution me to not get too excited, he proceeded to tell me that just because he's shaking my hand doesn't mean he thinks that I have any chance of going getting into heaven unless I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And you might think, oh, that's kind of offensive to say that, hey, you're pretty much going to hell, Shadi. But actually there was something very refreshing about that he came straight away and he didn't try to pretend or beat around the bush. He's like, I have my theological convictions and I'm not going to be shaken from them. And we start with that kind of understanding. Then we proceeded to have a respectful, friendly conversation. And I think that's possible, and that's a richer way of doing interfaith dialogue.
Yeah. Yes, please.
It's so refreshing to hear you say that, because one of the most frustrating things I had to deal with over the past decade is that kind of conversation. And it actually was vocalized by many of my Muslim friends, because in terms of Western Christianity, and especially coming from Britain, it was almost seen as a lack of politeness to proclaim your faith, because that could be offensive. So what you try to do is to be accommodating. And that frustrated my Muslim friends, knowing, because they said, please tell us what you believe so we can have a real conversation. And I think that is really important. But I've also come to learn over time, and I suppose it was pretty knee-jerk, probably for us as Egyptians, because we've lived, I'm sorry for being minorities. But I think we understand what real Christian-Muslim dialogue is, because it's a daily occurrence. Yeah. There are some things you should never talk about in a theological dialogue. I am never going to accept that Jesus Christ was just a prophet and a nice man. And a Muslim is never going to accept him as the incarnate Word of God and Savior. That's not going to happen. What we can talk about are social issues, issues of social justice, issues of citizenship, things that do bring us together. And I've seen more and more a moving away from the typical religious dialogue, interreligious dialogue, to one that is topical. Citizenship. So I was in the Emirates recently for a conversation on citizenship from a Muslim perspective and a Christian perspective. Because, my friend Muhammad was there as well. And it was wonderful to see that there was this ability for us to actually have that conversation in a real space with potentially real outcomes. But I have some consolation for you, and something that gives me comfort is that interreligious dialogue is no longer flavor of the month, which is good. Yeah. Because what it's done is it's taken off the table and out of the arena all the people who needed to do it to profile build or to get something out of it or to have a platform. And so the people left in the arena are people who actually want to do something about it if they're not in the spotlight. And I think the more we have closed doors meetings, conversations that are targeted, and a recognition that we are different and that's our starting point, then that becomes healthy. And we also recognize each other's struggles. So one thing I've said over and over is there is no monopoly on persecution. There's enough to go around to everybody. And we're all persecuted in different ways at different times. And to understand each other's vulnerability and to support one another when we're living in that state of vulnerability is really important. I've had an idea of having Christians from the Middle East as a minority there, a numeric minority, with Muslims in the West, a numeric minority, and coming together to discuss their experiences. Now, the difference is, and again, to be totally honest, the difference is that with Muslim communities in the West, they have generally come from somewhere ethnically, but for Christians in the Middle East, many of them are indigenous. So that's a difference in the paradigm. Yet still having the experience of the two groups in a numeric minority setting would be helpful.
Yeah, and I think this hits on something really important, and in many ways it's a bottom-up sort of engagement of civil society. To shift that a little bit on the role of governments and states in leading this type of work. Shadi, you mentioned the visit of the Pope to the UAE and the signing of the document on human fraternity by the Sheikh of Al-Azhar and the Pope. And there's kind of a number of other examples we could look at of kind of state-led interfaith engagement and religious reform initiatives. What's the role of those? Sam, I know you wrote about this some on Twitter of looking at some of the implications, but yeah.
I mean, I'm generally not a fan of these religious dialogues because I share Shadi's criticism of it's the nice guys, the guys who don't disagree much, who actually tend to meet. It's become an industry that has served many people in that regard. I still see some usefulness in something like the Pope's visit, and I said that, as you mentioned, on Twitter. I understand the propaganda aspect. It's there. It's part of what you deal with of the world. You don't choose a perfect world. You deal with what you're handed. But I still see the symbolism of millions of people in the Gulf for the first time, seeing for the first, in front of their very eyes, in their own countries, Christian Mass being celebrated. That matters. Because for many of these people, they grew up with these kinds of conspiracy theories and wrong ideas about Christianity that I said about Egypt, for example. So it's important because it also sends a message on the local level that, well, I'm not a fan of things like what President Sisi does in opening the cathedral and these kinds of things. I think they're propaganda. I don't think they change the reality on the ground. I'd rather he open a church in the smallest village in Egypt than the largest cathedral in the desert that no one will ever go to. But I also realized that for regular Egyptians, seeing that image on the TV of the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, of the President of Egypt, going and opening that cathedral and attending it, matters and might change people's lives on a daily in their daily dealing with government officials, in their dealing with their neighbors, with many others. So I think there's some usefulness in this. But I want to also build on something that Shadi said about this truthfulness and the theology. Yes, I wouldn't be offended if someone told me I'm going to hell. I mean, of course, in his religious faith, I will be. But if we need, and we do need, to talk about theology, we also need to talk about the practical things. I mean, the afterlife, let it be decided then. But the practical things, am I an equal citizen or am I a second-class citizen? Because some jurists some centuries ago put the rules of how I should be treated. Is the building of churches in the land of Islam allowed theologically or not? That's a conversation that we need to have. Because when you hear those people, regular folks, again, we're not talking about radical people. We're not talking about these butchers in the beach in Libya. We're talking about regular people who reject having a church in their village because it's an insult. Is that allowed or not? Are we equal or not? Is my sister to have an equal inheritance or not? Because currently, my sister will not get an equal inheritance in Egypt because Sharia is applied to me despite my best wishes. So when my parents die, I will get double what my sister gets, no matter whether I like it or not. I'm not allowed to adopt in Egypt because Islam prohibits adoption. Should that be applied to me as well or not? So I think there is a need for us to talk about theological aspects and their impact on politics and how they impact the lives of these communities who don't share the same theology and same belief.
Yeah, I think that's an important point in kind of the public role of faith. And Shadi, this is something I think you kind of get to in your framing of Islamic exceptionalism, of it's exceptional in its kind of withstanding the privatization or secularization thesis, which some of my colleagues at RFI have written in a book, God's Century, and others, that it's maybe not as exceptional as you might think. But yeah, Sam's kind of leading into where we may not debate over kind of the Christian and Muslim theology of the afterlife, but the practical implications of lived faith. How do we address that, the kind of public nature of faith and its implications?
Yeah, so, my position is that Islam has been and currently is and probably will continue to be resistant to secularization in a way that Christianity and perhaps other religions haven't been. So if you take my premise that Islam does play an outsized role in public life, at least for now, then it does raise a set of challenging questions. That said, I mean, one thing I always try to make clear is there's nothing automatically bad about religion playing a role in public life. It depends what kind of religion, what kind of religious interpretation. So someone could believe that Islam should play a central role in public life, but believe in progressive interpretations of the kinds of questions that Sam just put out. So I think we have to distinguish. Islam playing a public role doesn't necessarily translate into Islam playing a strict conservative role when it comes to the application of Sharia. Now, it has been that case in a number of examples in the Middle East, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And I think we've seen in the pre-modern era that there were Islam always played an overarching role and provided the overarching legal, moral, and political order that no one really questioned, or at least no Muslims generally questioned. But it was still a rather, at least for the time, a somewhat forgiving approach to questions of religious freedom and pluralism, not according to modern standards, but according to pre-modern standards. So, so I don't think that even if Islam, if we can't secularize, I don't even know what that would really mean, but if we can't secularize Islam or reform it or have it go through a reformation, and I think even presuming that Islam will follow that path is a little bit patronizing. It's almost like, oh, we Christians and others, we went through our Reformation, Enlightenment, secularization. You Muslims will get there too. I think there's something problematic, and it goes back to this idea that we're not all necessarily the same. We don't all necessarily follow the same linear trajectory, and that should be, and we should come at it from the standpoint that there may be differences there, but let's try to work with those differences and try to manage them and perhaps get past them, but not erase them necessarily. So I think that's sort of how I would see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how you manage it, and we can kind of look across the region, different attempts that have been made at that.
And I also completely agree, but words like secularization or reformation become offensive to many people. But there is no doubt that we all go through a process of adaptation. And if we don't, we die. I mean, humankind, if it doesn't adapt, it dies. Churches and mosques and religious institutions and political institutions and advocacy, we all go through adaptation. And so I think when we take away the problematic words of reformation or secularization, because many of those are rejected by many people who are religious, then adaptation is a must. And the asymmetry that we're talking about here, and I'm not meaning to cause offense, but very, very simply, it looks like I'm the one who's going to get into trouble after all this. We're fine. Sheikh al-Azhar is not the Pope, because Islam is not set up that way. There is no single leadership. It is not a hierarchical level. It is not a hierarchical system. It is very decentralized, intentionally. And that's the way it has functioned. And so to have the optics of the Pope and Sheikh al-Azhar signing a document, while it does have an optical benefit in some cases, actually becomes a bit of a disappointment, because it doesn't lead to anything practically on the ground. And I think the visit of the Pope to the Emirates is wonderful. The fact that he was received, the fact that there was a huge, large-scale mass, and you know, liturgies have been prayed in the Emirates by our own church for decades. So, but it haven't been seen at that level, on that scale, that publicly. And so I think that's where the real relevance is. It's the fact that we are seen to be doing things that are new and adapting to a new situation. Christianity and Islam are both a reality. Christianity is not going anywhere in the Middle East. You know, people tell me, what happens, do you think Christianity will become extinct? Absolutely not. There'll always be a Christian presence. But because it becomes a greater minority, there'll be more pressure on the ones who stay. Mm-hmm. So it'll be more problematic. And is Islam going to cease to be in the West? Of course not. Because it is a reality. And so we need to stop thinking about how to solve a problem that is not really a problem because it will no longer exist, because the reality is we are having to coexist. And that's where our importance needs to lie. And finally, just something that Sam said about the optics. And optics are very important. And of course, all of us with optics, you know, whether it's your it's your Twitter feed or your profile, we all like a bit of the ideal. You know, everyone's sort of airbrushing their pictures and trying to present ourselves, whether we're individuals or organizations.
Do bishops also do that?
I don't need to. But there is no, I think it is acceptable to have a difference between the ideal and the reality, but they should not be contradictory. There's always going to be a margin of difference. But if they're contradictory, then we have a problem, because that becomes an illusion or a deception.
Very quick. Yep. I think Archbishop brings up a really important point. And when I read the document on human fraternity that was signed by the Pope and Al-Azhar's Grand Imam, Ahmed Tayyib, I thought to myself, wait a second, why is this being signed by these two sides? I mean, because Al-Azhar is not the equivalent of the Vatican and the Grand Imam is not the equivalent of the Pope, and to kind of elevate Al-Azhar to that position of representing, or presumably, I guess, representing Sunni Muslims or Sunni Islam, I think that struck me as rather problematic, but also, for reasons we don't have to get into right now, Al-Azhar doesn't have a great record. I mean, it is still the religious arm of a controversial political regime. And we can't forget that Al-Azhar is not independent. Al-Azhar is instrumentalized and used, not just by this regime, but by every Egyptian regime, again, since pretty much the 1950s. I wish there was an alternative to Al-Azhar, but there isn't, and that does present a kind of difficulty here in that there isn't really anyone who can perhaps play that role, but that's just the reality.
Yeah, and for that, a commercial for your project on Islam as Statecraft, a recent report. For our last 10 minutes or so, let's bring you all into the conversation that perhaps questions at that gap between perception and reality. So we have a mic going around, perhaps here.
Yes, Jeremy, yeah. No, thank you so much. Wonderful to see you, Archbishop, here in Washington. Mohammed Al-Sanusi, my name. I direct the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers. There are a number of issues raised in this panel. And, Archbishop articulated very well how the interreligious dialogue and collaboration is moving and how it should be topical. I completely agree with that. And I completely believe that it is critical to engage with those conservative in interreligious dialogue, but it's not either or. I think, sometimes you have to go to the zone of comfort. And I remember 2 years ago, we were meeting with Tom Farr here, and Tom said that, I am a Catholic from my gray hair to my toe. Right? And we want to work together, and I appreciate that. But at the same time, the talking to the liberal religious communities, it helps to get you to that point as well. So it's not either or. Sometimes you have to do that. Second point I want to make, and that is the visit of the Pope in the UAE. I was there last week. And I think it is historic. It is a step forward. It is huge success, no question about it. But I also agree, we were in the room with the Pope, 200 plus religious leaders from around the world when that document was signed. I completely agree, it is a step forward, but Al-Azhar, I would love to see in that, beside Al-Azhar, there is the Mufti of Indonesia, for instance, or representing the Muslim communities in India, 200 million plus, or Nigeria, or some, that basically will give you a better image, and it advances the work that we are trying to do. So I think I really don't want to just, I want to just say that, we're making progress. There is no question about it, and we have to build on this as we move forward. Because of this interreligious dialogue and relationship, today we see scholars are coming forward and digging into Islamic history and coming up with the documents that clearly says what you are doing in the Muslim majority communities or the Middle East regarding religious numeric minorities, as the bishop says, and I completely agree, is wrong. Like the Marrakech declarations and other declarations that were put forward. So if it is not that interaction within interreligious communities, we will not get there. Even these issues of adoptions you mentioned, this is I think there is a misunderstanding of this issue, misinterpretation of Islam. There is a lack of adaptation to Islam in this century. So all of this is there. We just need to put forward the right perspective. Thank you, Your Honor.
Very good. Any responses? Other questions?
My name is Michael. 20 years ago, 19 years ago, after the murder of 20 plus Christians in Al-Qusha, I participated in a panel discussion, and the theme was, or the problems were, from our view at the time, was the lack of central authority in Islam to kind of rule the masses, to deal with issues that Sam talked about, the role of, or the rights of non-Muslims under Islam. 20 years later, and maybe several thousand martyrs, we're still dealing with the same issue. Nothing has happened. So question to Shadi, from an academic perspective, and also, you know, given your background as well, what is it that you think should happen to develop such an authority? Because from my point of view, if you don't have that authority, and you move towards some sort of rules and guidelines that be applied everywhere, that come from within Islam, that define these issues that maybe we in Egypt deal with a lot, and a lot of other minorities may not deal with. But without that central authority or the existence of such authority, I don't see a lot of improvement, because I see a lot of everyone making their own fatwa and deciding whatever decree they want to decide and impose that on their local populations.
Okay. Yeah. So you're right. It's really important, I think, to note, as you did, that this has been going on for a long time, and that's why it's frustrating, right? But the decline in the rights of minorities and the situation of Christians has happened in large part under not just, you know, Islamic or religious context, but also under so-called secular authoritarian regimes. So I think that's important to remember, that even those who claim to be more secular and progressive have been a big part of the problem, and we have to think about alternatives to that status quo, because that hasn't worked. Now, whether that is about finding a central authority, I don't think that you can do that, because then it would just sort of defeat the purpose of Sunni Islam. I mean, that's just not what the religion is. Now, you can have the religious establishment playing a prominent constructive role, and I would argue that at various points in the pre-modern era, the religious establishment did play that constructive role in providing a check on the executive authority, in this case the sultan or the caliph, right? So there is a history of a kind of balance between clerics kind of saying, oh, executive authority, you're going too far, and we have a kind of inherent religious legitimacy. That said, I think it's hard to replicate that in the modern era, because people are better educated. You have very high levels of literacy in a number of Arab countries now, in some countries 90% plus. So it's very hard to tell people, well, follow a cleric, when they're making their own decisions about the information they take in and things that they want, and what they follow in the news and so on and so forth. So I don't think that there's a way to go back to this model of deference to clerical authorities. So for me, the best alternative is some kind of political understanding, and that would be ideally through constitutions, where constitutions elaborate clearly and in detail regarding the rights that all citizens have. And there it's more of like a civil social compact, and coming from political parties and civil society organizations, rather than from religious establishments that are telling Muslims what to believe or what to say. I just don't think that works anymore, especially when religious authorities are compromised, and I think religious authorities will stay compromised for a very long time. So now, how do you get to good constitutions? That's a whole different conversation. And there was some progress in that direction, I think, in the Middle East. There's one country where it has gone pretty well, and I think that we can we can look to them to some extent for all their faults. They're not perfect, but Tunisia, I think, has come up with one of the most progressive constitutions that does go quite a long way to protecting religious and political pluralism and political and religious freedoms. Not perfect, but better than pretty much everyone else in the region. And that happened, I should say, under the leadership of secularists and Islamists together in coalition. And I think that's the very important part of that it is possible for Islamists and non-Islamist parties to actually get along enough to come up with a compromise constitutional document.
We have time for about one final question.
There's got to be one more, right?
Otherwise, we can leave it there and yeah. Wait for the mic 1 second.
Hi, I'm Richard Fulton with the Religious Freedom Center at the Freedom Forum Institute here in Washington. The question I have is, you've been talking about roles of minorities and potential for new constitution. Here in the United States, which prides itself, of course, on separation of church and state and religious pluralism, there seems to be a different conflict that's going on sometimes, the conflict of secularism versus religious observance, and the extent to which people who don't hold the modern points of view on religious beliefs tend now to be treated as pariahs, just as it used to be that people who didn't have the right sexual orientation or what have you, they were treated with pariahs as pariahs. Thankfully, no longer the case, but now we seem to be in a place where religion is being put in a corner. To what extent do you see that playing out, and to what extent does that perhaps explain some of the concerns about change in the Middle East, the concern that somehow those kinds of trends would have what would be seen as a negative impact on societies that see themselves as having particular religious identity?
Archbishop.
Obviously, I can't answer specifically as to the situation in the United States, but I think more generically, religious bodies, institutions, authorities now need to have a greater legitimacy than ever before. I think we're in a state at the moment with individuals and organizations that there is no longer a respect for the sake of respect, but it's an acceptance and adherence to something that people believe in. And the more legitimate we ourselves make ourselves, the more we will be respected and followed, and the more we will be effective. The problem is that religion is now seen as either an obstacle to many things in terms of moral and ethical issues, or the propagator of lots of conflict in terms of religious conflict and strife. And we need to change that narrative. We hear a lot about counter-narratives. I don't think counter-narratives are healthy. I think we need to re-own the narrative. And that is that our faith makes us better people, contribute to a better society, and be able to accept and influence from a position of legitimacy and honesty and honor and accountability. And that comes from problems in all religions where we see people doing things in our name and we let them happen, whether it be micro issues or macro issues, whether they be regional, national, or even international. And so we need to own our own problems in terms of saying, yes, well, this is an issue that we need to deal with. There may not be a simple solution or a quick solution, but we need to look for a solution. And then what we need to do is also work together. So I stand to gain nothing if I back my Muslim brother into a corner and put him in a position where he's in checkmate. Because what does he do with that? There needs to be an opportunity for us to work together. I need to say, well, you may have a problem I can help with. So let's work together, because this is our problem. This is our shared space, is our shared society. Likewise, when I have a problem, someone comes to my aid and says, let's work on this together. So as long as we have this tribal ideal of who wins, because there's only one winner, then we all lose. And that's why I'm saying it needs to become collaborative. So when a pastor here in the US started to speak about burning a Quran, we all stood up and said, not in my name. Because you know what, I wouldn't do it. I don't expect it to be done to my Bible, so I don't want anyone to do it to a Quran. I don't believe in what's in the Quran as my mode of faith, but I respect that it is someone's faith. And as long as it doesn't interfere with social norms, social justice, matters of equality, then I can protect those who want to live that faith. But it's not just one person's problem anymore. And as long as we continue with this chess game, then we all lose legitimacy.
Final comments?
Yeah, sure. I might be curious what you'll say, but maybe you'll find something to disagree with me on at the end. But so I think this is a really important point because I'm sensing it more and more in the American context, and so beyond my evangelical buddies in Nashville, most of my friends and the people I hang out with have been in major urban centers, pretty secular, suspicious of religion, generally speaking. That's what I saw growing up, outside of Philadelphia. I've lived in D.C. for a while now, and it's almost when you hear someone like a Christian American saying I'm Christian and affirming their faith in a kind of outward way. It might sound odd to some of you here, but in my context, it's like, whoa, that is unusual, And it's also something that if people feel that or want to express that, there's almost a stigma in certain circles. So I think that, and the assumption was always that the decline of Christianity or the decline of Christian religious practice was going to be a good thing for society, but it's sort of be careful what you wish for, and we really have to question that narrative because the decline of Christianity here in the US and particularly in Europe, where we see really tremendous declines in, say, weekly church attendance to take one indicator, but you could take any number of other indicators. Has that led to more social cohesion, more religious tolerance? What we're seeing in Europe now is the rise of right-wing populism and intolerant forms of ethno-nationalism. Here in the US, we're seeing the rise of white nationalism. And I would argue that some of that has to do with the ideological vacuum that we're seeing in Western democracies, where religion is no longer providing that meaning or purpose or that social cohesion. Something has got to take its place. And what takes its place isn't necessarily better. And I think that I would hope that more and more people realize that, because I think we're seeing the risks of over-secularization in much of the West right now.
Sam, a final word?
What was it, a month ago was the episode of the Covington Boys. I think that episode really surprised me by the amount of anti-Catholic, anti-Christian sentiment that I saw expressed by members of the media, people people that I follow on Twitter or on Facebook. And it was surprising because the American experience has been very different from the European one. The kind of secularism that you had in Europe, this wall of separation between church and state, and I have Tom Farr to thank here. He was my professor at Georgetown teaching me about Jefferson's letter and the debate about that in the Supreme Court's interpretation. But the American ideal of religious freedom and of secularism was very different from the European. And we're slowly moving to that European model. And it was a moment of reflection and I would say a slight alarm. But then I remembered I'm a Copt. It comes with the DNA. we're used to being a minority. There was a lot of talk in the beginning of today's events about what's unique about those Copts. And every Coptic child is told the story of Saint Athanasius, of someone coming to him and telling him, the whole world is against you, Athanasius. And his famous reply, and Athanasius contra mandum, and Athanasius is against the world. It comes with your DNA as a Copt that you accept that life is a defeat, because it also isn't a defeat. But that contradiction, that acceptance that you will not get what you want in this world, that you are promised something different, that's part of what has made the Coptic Church unique. The Catholic Church has had a rich history of engagement with the temporal world, in positive and negative terms. So have Protestant churches. The Eastern Orthodox churches have had a rich engagement since Constantine with a unique relationship with the Byzantine Empire. Today we see that in Russia between the Orthodox Church and Putin regime. We never had that. We never developed a political theology. We never built that. We never came with that baggage. So in a sense, when I see this growing attack on religious expression in the public sphere in America, is it alarming? Yes, but it's also something that I accept as what I'm promised in this world.
May I disagree with that?
Quickly.
Very quickly, I'm just clarifying. I'm sure he agrees. I don't think that it's every child sees that the world is a defeat. I think we see that the world is going to be a challenge, but at the end of the challenge is victory.
And in light of today's events, I think that's a profound place to leave it. So please join me in thanking the panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, these final comments by several of our speakers provide a perfect way, I think, to very briefly close the importance of the last 3 hours. I'm particularly struck by Shadi's comment that the long hoped for positive benefits of secularism haven't always produced quite what we had hoped that they would produce, which makes all the more relevant what we've talked about the last 3 hours. And I'd just make four quick points for you as we close. We gathered here today because of this picture and because of the book about the 21 people who were martyred in 2015, and we are grateful to Martin Mosebach for being with us today, and mostly for what he has said in that book that I think is so important. The second point I want to make is this. Martin's book serves as a very poignant reminder that religious freedom matters because religion matters. Sometimes we talk about religious freedom as that's some kind of abstract thing we're committed to without remembering why it is we care about religious freedom. We care about religious freedom because without religion we cannot be fully human. We can't be human if we can't ask transcendent questions and try to be faithful to what we find out. That book, this book, the 21, talked about the faith of those 21. It talked about the serenity and faithfulness that he discovered was consistent with their lives and how they were raised and what their parents thought and how they believed. They testified that faith is real, that it's deep, it's not of this world. It was a vivid testimony that death does not have the last word. The third point, I want to quote something from the book that wasn't quoted yet today. When Martin interviewed the parents of the oldest of the 21 martyrs, a man by the name, the martyr was Tadros, and he was talking to his wife. His wife reported on one occasion when he was a migrant worker in Libya that he called on the phone to say that he was being pressured to change his name. Now, this is before he's in captivity for 43 days, obviously before his martyrdom. And Tadros responded, anyone who starts changing his name will end up changing his faith. Something profoundly religious, like the wrist and what's on the wrist and what it represents. And the fourth and final point I want to make, also comes from something that was in the book as well. Early in the book, Martin, in one of his rare moments where he actually says something about the perpetrators of the barbarity, and this citation that he quoted was on the video for all to hear. And what he said was to the world, to Rome, as he said, and to all of the world, he said, "This terror shall crawl under your skin, never to ever leave you. From now on, you will know that your world has already perished." What we have here is the conflict of two worldviews. A worldview that believes in terror and power having the last word, and the world that Martin talked about, that he discovered in the upper parts and villages of Egypt, that had a radically different conception of where this power was. Their world, which that terrorists said was coming to an end, in fact, their world was not of this world. It was a world where death and suffering is not the last word. And that is the witness of this wonderful book. And we thank the author for bringing the story of the 21 to our attention today. We thank you for all of our special guests who've been here. We thank you for all coming. And I also want to thank the Bruderhof, what is it? Community, the Bruderhof community and the publishing house, Plow Publishing House, who have made this possible. Thank you all for coming. Next door, so please come and enjoy some refreshments.